Well, since this is the first Sunday of the month, it's time for our monthly What is Written study. And here is our first question. Again, I reworded the question, but here it is. If Jack has a right to marry Jill, and she claims to be scripturally divorced, how can Jack truly be 100% sure that Jill is divorced lawfully in God's eyes and not falsely making that claim? Well, that's a pretty good question for someone in that situation to consider. And I would suggest to you that there are questions that Jack needs to ask. He needs to ask, well, what is the evidence of adultery in Jill's former marriage? Why is this claim being made? Sometimes people do lie, and they lie about former marriages, and sometimes people jump to unfounded conclusions. When I was preaching in Johnson City, there was a young woman who married a man who had been married before, and he assured her that he had scriptural grounds for divorce. Well, later on, for a variety of reasons, she began to suspect that what he had told her was not true, and she contacted his first wife, and she assured this lady that the fellow she was married to was the guilty party in that first marriage. So sometimes people do lie, and sometimes people jump to unfounded conclusions. Another question that I think needs to be asked is, can this evidence be substantiated by other people? And, of course, can Jack trust Jill? And how does he know? And should Jack marry Jill if she can't be trusted? That's not a good idea, is it? You need to be able to trust the person that you're about to marry. And so I think those are some questions that someone in Jack's shoes would need to ask and consider. But how can fornication be detected? Well, one of the ways is by catching someone in the act. You'll remember the story that is recorded for us in John chapter 8 about the adulterous woman, and she was brought before Jesus, and they said that they had caught her in the act. So certainly that's one of the ways that adultery or fornication can be detected. But that's not the only way. Another way that it can be detected is if someone confesses this sin. You may recall that when the prophet Nathan confronted David by telling him that story about the man who had the ewe lamb and the rich neighbor stole the ewe lamb. Well, David confessed. He said, I have sinned. Now, of course, Nathan already knew what David had done. In fact, Nathan tells David before he confesses what he had done. And so David didn't have to specify his sin. He just said, I have sinned. But I think this illustrates that confession is a way whereby fornication can be detected. But I don't think that's the only way. Circumstantial evidence can point to fornication. For example, pregnancy out of wedlock is a sure sign that someone has committed fornication. You remember the story of Judah and Tamar that's recorded for us in Genesis chapter 38? Well, Judah was told that Tamar had played the harlot. Of course, you know the rest of the story. But she became pregnant, and that's how that sin was detected by other people. Someone's presence overnight, where someone should not be spending the night, is circumstantial evidence that fornication has been committed. A friend of mine in Texas and another preacher sat in a car all night outside a man's apartment, and my friend's wife's car was parked outside his apartment. That caused my friend, along with some other circumstantial evidence, to believe that his wife had been unfaithful to him. Our next door neighbor in Tennessee discovered a hotel receipt. And she confronted her husband, and he confessed his adultery. The testimony of other people can be circumstantial evidence. Texts, emails, lipstick stains on one's collar, those kinds of things can be circumstantial evidence pointing to sexual immorality. We shouldn't be troubled by the fact that sometimes all we have is circumstantial evidence, because murderers are convicted in the courts of our land all the time on the basis of circumstantial evidence. Now, I don't know what you think about the O.J. Simpson trial, but it sure looks to me like the circumstantial evidence that was presented, and I wasn't in the courtroom, I was kind of enamored by all of that for a while, and I watched a fair amount. But I'll tell you, I believe that the circumstantial evidence points to O.J. as the one who committed those murders. So circumstantial evidence can point to immorality. Well, what kind of circumstantial evidence? Behavioral changes, increased secrecy. When your marriage partner becomes unusually private, locking their phone, hiding their messages, leaving the room to take calls, that may be an indication. Emotional distancing. If there's a shift in emotional connection between husband and wife, such decreased affection or engagement can sometimes signal a problem. And then there's inconsistent explanations. A partner's stories about their whereabouts or their activities where they just don't match up, that can be some circumstantial evidence. Changes in intimacy can be an indication. And that can be either a sudden increase or a sudden decrease. unexplained guilt or defensiveness. If one's mate seems overly guilty or defensive or avoidant, that may be an indication that something is going on. And then, of course, there can be physical evidence. I've already mentioned that. Unexplained marks or scents, lipstick on the collar, perfume, a woman's perfume on your husband's shirt, and it's not your perfume, that kind of thing. A change in appearance. If one's mate suddenly becomes concerned about their appearance when they had not been before, or when they begin to dress differently, changes in routine or habits, when they frequently are working late, if there is increased focus on personal devices, if they're spending excessive time on their phone or their computer, that might be circumstantial evidence that something is going on. Emotional or behavioral shifts. Unexplained mood swings. Emotional volatility, such as anger or guilt. Overcompensation. If your partner is suddenly extra loving, attentive, or generous, they may be attempting to make up for their feelings of guilt. And then there's the gut feeling, intuition. But I hasten to caution that God's Word tells us that the heart is a deceitful thing. And so we can't often trust our, quote, gut feelings. Communication patterns. Less communication. Or deflecting or avoiding difficult conversations. And then there's external feedback. I've already mentioned that, comments from others. So all of this is the kind of circumstantial evidence, and no doubt there's perhaps more that could be mentioned. But these kinds of things might very well point to detecting fornication. The question is the cumulative circumstantial evidence conclusive? That's the question that has to be answered. It just occurred to me, I didn't think about it earlier, but one of the ways that fornication can be detected is if you hire a private investigator to follow your mate around. We see that in the TV shows and in the movies. Well, that happens in real life. There was a case when I was preaching in Mississippi where the wife suspected that her husband was unfaithful, and he met with me and the elders, and he swore that he had not committed fornication, but a private detective was hired and pictures were taken that conclusively showed that he was lying and he was being immoral. But we need to understand that fornication is not abuse. It's not alienation of affection. It's not desertion. It's not drunkenness. It's not drug abuse, incompatibility, irritability. It's not irreconcilable differences or irresponsibility, insanity, imprisonment, persecution. It is not viewing pornography. And the one reason for which Jesus allows divorce and remarriage is if one's mate has committed fornication. None of these things are fornication. So, divorce is not for fornication if fornication has not occurred. Now, I know that's obvious, but sometimes the obvious needs to be mentioned. And so, if someone is contemplating divorce for fornication, that person needs to know that fornication has occurred. Because you can't divorce someone for fornication if it hasn't occurred. Divorce is not for fornication if fornication is merely suspected and not confirmed. And divorce is not for fornication if fornication has occurred, but it is unknown. Are you with me? If a husband has committed fornication and his wife does not know that, she cannot divorce him for fornication. That's logically impossible. That cannot be the reason for which she is obtaining a divorce. And divorce is not for fornication if fornication has occurred, but it does not become known until after the divorce. Are you with me? Fornication must be the cause for the divorce, not the consequence of the divorce. I would suggest to you that divorce is not for fornication if fornication has occurred, but it's not the real reason for the divorce. In other words, if a wife were to say something like this, well, I can put up with his immorality, I just can't put up with his laziness and the fact that he won't work, or I can't put up with his drunkenness, I can't put up with his gambling, whatever it is. Do you see the distinction that I'm making? Why is the divorce being obtained? Also, divorce is not for fornication if the guilty party divorces the innocent party. The guilty party does not divorce the innocent party for fornication. The innocent party has not committed fornication. Now, the guilty party may divorce his mate because he wants to get rid of her and he wants to be with his mistress or whatever, but he's not divorcing the innocent party for fornication. Do you see that? And divorce is not for fornication if fornication occurs after there has been a divorce for some other reason. There are some preachers that I know who believe that if a couple are married and one of the mates seeks a divorce, the other mate did not want the divorce, did everything that they could do to stop the divorce, but it went through nonetheless. And then later, the mate that sought the divorce marries somebody else, then this other mate can then mentally or somehow divorce them for fornication. Now, that scenario is worth an entire study all on its own. But I would submit to you that divorce is not for fornication for these various reasons. Fornication is the only grounds upon which Jesus permits divorce and remarriage. And therefore, someone needs to be sure that their mate has been guilty of fornication before they seek a divorce, let alone whether they contemplate marrying somebody else later on. We really do need to be sure about this. Well, I'm going to have to hurry. Second question. How can we know that God's providence was working in the lives of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz rather than time, chance, and personal choices? Does God work providentially in our lives as much as people claim or think He does, or is this wishful thinking on the part of humans? Well, I think that's a good question. Let me remind you that some things occur in our world today by natural law. In other words, when God created the universe, He established the laws of nature, as we commonly call them, and those laws of nature provide various weather patterns and other kinds of things. Jesus said that God causes His sun to shine on the just and the unjust. He brings rain for the righteous and the wicked. God provided fruitful seasons for the Gentiles. The Hebrew writer tells us that our universe is sustained or upheld by the Word of Christ. The Bible also teaches that some things occur by chance. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 9 verse 12 that time and chance happen to all men. Some things occur by choice. David committed adultery with Bathsheba because David made a series of wrong choices. And then there are things that occur by God's providence. Hannah was barren. She prayed to the Lord that she might have a son, and the Lord answered her prayer and gave her a son. But we need to understand and recognize that people can mistakenly claim God's providence. We've seen that 3 times in our study of 1 Samuel. King Saul believed that God had delivered his nemesis, David, into his hands when David went to the city of Keilah, and that was a walled city, and Saul thought, I have him now. God's delivered my enemy into my hands. David's men believed that God had delivered Saul into David's hand when he went into that cave at En-Gedi. And in 1 Samuel 26, we haven't gotten there yet, Abishai believed that God had delivered Saul into David's hands. Well, all of those were mistaken claims for God's providence. And today, some people who are not true Christians claim God's providence. Well, how do I know that they're not true Christians? Because they haven't done what Jesus says you must do to become a Christian. And so you'll hear people claim that God spoke to me, or that God laid this on my heart. So some claims about providence are misguided, wishful thinking. Having said that, I hasten to point out that God can work in the lives of non-Christians. In other words, you don't have to be a Christian for God to work providentially in your life. God used Nebuchadnezzar as his tool. And God raised up Cyrus, the king of Persia, and used him to bring the remnant back to the land and rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem. Luke tells us in Acts 10 that Cornelius, his prayers went up to God as a memorial, and the next thing we know, an angel tells Cornelius to send to Joppa and fetch Simon. I don't know what Cornelius was praying about, we're not told. But in light of what happens after his prayers, my educated guess is that he was praying about salvation, and God in his providence brought the prospect and the preacher together. Now the question was specifically about God's providence in the book of Ruth. I want you to notice that the book tells us that Yahweh provided bread. There were those who said, Yahweh deal kindly with you. Yahweh's hand has gone out against Naomi. Naomi says, Yahweh has brought me home empty. Yahweh has testified against me. Now, those statements certainly indicate that the characters in the story of Ruth believed that God was working providentially at that time. So let's just think about the things that happened in the book. There was a famine. Elimelech and his two sons die. They hear that there's bread in Israel. Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest, and Ruth goes out to glean in the fields of Boaz. And we read about Boaz being someone who cared for his workers, and he shows compassion on Ruth. And he has heard a report from others about Ruth's compassion for her mother-in-law. And Boaz shows kindness to Ruth. And on one occasion, Ruth gleaned an ephah of barley, a far greater amount of grain than would normally have been harvested or gleaned because of Boaz's kindness. And we learned that Boaz was a near kinsman. He instructs his workers to allow Ruth to glean until the end of harvest, and Naomi comes up with a plan. And you remember we studied that not long ago. She sends Ruth to the threshing floor at night, and Ruth makes this bold proposal, basically asking Boaz to marry her, and he accepts her proposal. Naomi is confident that Boaz will act immediately. That's what she tells Ruth when she comes back the next morning. And so Boaz goes to the city gate, and lo and behold, the nearer relative, the nearer kinsman, shows up at the city gate. At first, he accepts the proposal that he marry Ruth, and then he refuses it. He wants the land, he doesn't want the wife. Or is it the other way around? My brain's a little fuzzy this morning. Boaz and Ruth marry. She conceives. We learned that Ruth is the great-grandmother of David. And the Moabitess Ruth is mentioned in Naomi's genealogy of Jesus. Is God's providence at work in this story? Well, it sure looks to me like all of this is just too much of a coincidence for us to conclude anything else. John Reed observes 8 times the characters in the book spoke of God's activity. The Lord was regularly petitioned to answer prayers on their behalf. 5 times blessings from the Lord was invoked on behalf of faithful people. Ruth and Boaz committed themselves to carry out their responsibilities in light of God's fidelity. Boaz commended Ruth for seeking refuge under the wings of Israel's God. Once again, as I've already said, it sure looks to me like the characters in the story believe that God is working behind the scenes. So how do we detect providence? Well, of course, the easiest way is when the Bible tells us that God is working behind the scenes. We are told repeatedly in the story of Joseph that God was with him. And so we can know for sure that God was working. But then also, I think providence can be detected by circumstances that point to his providence in a conclusive kind of way. Later in his life, when the famine came and then his brothers go to Egypt to buy grain, and then ultimately when Joseph reveals himself to them and they're all worried that Joseph's going to punish them, Joseph explains that God sent him ahead to preserve life. That they had meant it all for evil, but God meant it for good. Well, how did Joseph come to that conclusion? Well, I suspect he came to that conclusion because he connected the dots, and that was the only reasonable conclusion for him to draw. Paul talks about God opening doors for him in the gospel. We need to remember God's promises, and we need to remember answered prayer. The promises of God and answered prayer presuppose the providence of God. But I would suggest to you that providence is often, or perhaps I should say, or usually detected after the fact rather than in the moment. I'm out of time. Thank you. I do need questions.